Good morning, everyone. We're going to go ahead and get started with our webinar since it's right at 11 o'clock Mountain Time. The Mountain Plains Prevention Technology Transfer Center at the University of Utah is excited to welcome you to our 5-part webinar series, Scope of Prevention Along the Continuum of Care. Before we get started, I'd like to go over a couple of housekeeping announcements with you. A recording of this webinar will be posted on our website at pttcnetwork.org/mountainplains. The slides available in a PDF format will also be posted on this website. For those of you interested in a certificate following today's webinar, please email mountainplains_pttc@utah.edu. We are an approved NAADAC provider. For all other licensure and credentials, please apply directly to your board. All participants have been muted, but we encourage you to use the chat feature for questions and messages. At the end of this webinar, we will be adding a GEPRA link, which is our survey. It's very important for all participants to complete that survey, so please do so before logging off of the webinar. The purpose of this webinar series is to discuss strategies and interventions used to prevent substance use, decrease risk if substance use has already occurred, as well as to discuss strategies for preventing relapse after treatment or during maintenance/recovery. Components of the Institute of Medicine, or IOM's, Behavioral Health Continuum of Care model will be highlighted and discussed throughout the webinar series. In this series, we want to highlight that prevention can occur anywhere along the continuum of care, including during treatment and maintenance and recovery. Before we dive into the Institute of Medicine's model, we want to acknowledge that some of you may be familiar with slightly different prevention models depending upon the setting you work in. For those of you who participated in our last series, we discussed some of those different frameworks and models. For example, many of you are familiar with SAMHSA's strategic prevention framework, which is more of a comprehensive framework or planning process to prevent substance use and misuse. However, some of you may also be familiar with the prevention triangle, which is often used in schools and other educational settings. We want to point out that all of these models are complementary rather than exclusive. Many of you may be familiar with the IOM's Mental Health Intervention Spectrum model, which was published in 1994, and that offers a framework for addressing behavioral health, including substance use disorders. This model begins with promotion, then prevention, treatment, and maintenance and recovery across the continuum, while recognizing that promotion also occurs across the entire continuum. Today's webinar will focus on selective and indicated prevention. Selective prevention aims to reduce impact use that has already occurred, and indicated aims to soften the impact of ongoing use that has lasting effects. Other webinars in this series will focus on other components of the IOM model. It is now my pleasure to introduce our presenter today. Dr. Erin Fisher is a faculty member in the Educational Psychology Department at the College of Education here at the University of Utah, and works with schools across Utah to build and sustain contemporary behavioral and social emotional programs both in elementary and secondary settings. Dr. Fisher also has an appointment at the University of Utah School of Medicine's Department of Psychiatry, where he is the director of their Pediatric Feeding Disorders Clinic. It is my pleasure to turn the time over to Dr. Fisher.
Good morning, everyone. Thanks so much for being here and joining me today to talk about selective and indicated school-based prevention interventions. Thanks to the Mountain Plains PTTC for inviting me to come and talk about this topic, which is one that I'm incredibly passionate about. And I hope that today, after our webinar, that you guys have some more interest or some ideas about how you might be able to collaborate with schools to provide some of these really, really important prevention services. Some disclosures to indicate for this presentation. Currently, we have a project that's funded called the WellBeing Program by the Cambia Health Foundation, and I just wanted to make sure that you all were aware of that. Okay, so let's jump in and talk about our key questions that we will be focusing on this morning. First is, how do you screen and triage services to students in schools? Secondly, what are the available prevention interventions in schools for students who are at risk for or already experiencing social, emotional, and/or behavioral problems? And last but not least, what can you do to partner with schools to deliver these services? Okay, as we jump in, I'd really like to give a shout out to my lab here at the University of Utah. We are the Technology and Training Education Consultation Lab, and our work focuses on providing multi-tiered behavior supports and consultation in schools, teleconsultation supports through telehealth technologies like video conferencing and other web-based technologies. We also provide professional development to teachers and school staff around the state of Utah and nationally. We provide functional assessment and function-based treatment planning to help students who exhibit behavior problems, social emotional problems. And we also have a multi-tiered school mental health program that we focus on that provides multiple types of prevention efforts across the continuum for over 750 students here in Salt Lake City at a middle school and high school. Finally, we also have integrated public school day treatment programs where we partner with local school districts to try to keep some of the students who have the most acute needs in the school system, stabilizing their behavior and mental health so that they can receive access to education in a less restrictive environment. So I just wanted to give you guys that context as we jump in, and a shout out to all these incredible graduate students and volunteers who helped to make this work possible. Okay, as we look at this slide, this is how we're going to orient to the whole webinar for today. This model is something that we use at our school mental health program, which focuses on secondary settings. So we're targeting adolescents who are in middle school and high school in Salt Lake City. And this project, like I mentioned before, is funded by the Cambia Health Foundation. And in partnership with that organization and the schools, we're able to provide some pretty robust services. So let me kind of go through this model and talk about the various types of supports that we offer at each tier. Today's topics will focus mostly on those tier 2, tier 3 supports. Oh, sorry about that, which are highlighted here in yellow. Let me start at the bottom. I know last week you talked a lot about universal supports and programming that are in place. And so I'm not going to spend much time talking about that, but I think it's critical to remind everyone who's on this call that the universal supports are the foundation for all of the other services, all the prevention efforts that we provide in schools as we move forward. Some of the types of universal supports are social emotional learning. Some of the items would be Second Step or other curriculums that exist in schools with the main purpose of improving school-wide social emotional outcomes, things like empathy, problem solving, communication skills. And through these school-wide social and emotional supports, we are attempting to improve things like attitudes and beliefs, help reinforce school rules, provide systems of reinforcement to continue to maintain positive behaviors. We also really focus at the tier 1 level on school culture, both class-wide and school-wide. And we would be remiss if we weren't considering teachers' well-being. And we're also trying to help them be more equipped and empowered to handle prevention efforts for students who may be at risk or experiencing symptoms associated with psychopathology and subsequently substance use. The last piece we're really focused on too is family involvement. Okay, so that's the supports, that's the foundation that all of these services that we're going to talk about today are built on. And without those tier 1 universal supports, which are the really frontline prevention efforts, we really don't have a fighting chance at any of the other services that we want to do. And I think this is a really important piece. And the more that I've spent time in schools, it's really the #1 problem that we need to address. And I think from a collaborative effort with agencies and other substance use prevention specialists, we can really help in this area. Okay, enough of that, because I know today we're really here to talk about those tier 2, tier 3 selective and individualized prevention efforts. So looking at the yellow part of the triangle, this is about 15% of students at any given population. And what we're trying to do at this tier 2 level is provide more targeted supports that look at certain students in the schools who maybe didn't respond well to prevention efforts at the tier 1 level. And then at the tier 3 level, looking at the red box, these are the students who have current needs that rise to the occasion and need more than targeted supports. They need those individualized supports to prevent them from developing worse symptomology, engaging in substance use, having academic failure, those really, really important things that we know ultimately tend to lead to incarceration and really undesired outcomes for individuals, particularly students, in the long term. So this model kind of sets the stage, and we're going to revisit this model at the end to talk a little bit more. But I want to jump in and talk about how we make decisions going from tier 1 and up. So this first step is, how do we screen and triage out these services so that we're making sure that the students we're serving get those services that they need. Okay, this measure, which is called the Student Subjective Wellbeing Questionnaire, is our frontline tool that we use. And this was developed by Tyler Renshaw at Utah State University. He's a great colleague. The link that I have on the slide is gives access to the measures I'm showing, as well as the research. And this is important to note that Dr. Renshaw has made these available through open science efforts so that folks can continue to use these measures and have accessibility to tools that are really beneficial and helpful without having to pay fees for these things and get them in the hands of schools. So this scale, the Student Subjective Wellbeing Questionnaire, really looks at those areas that are important to students as far as how well they enjoy learning, how well they're connected to their school, the educational purpose, so knowing what the rationale is and why they're there, and then academic efficacy scale, so how well they perceive themselves as being able to do this work. Now, as you can imagine, this is a subjective well-being questionnaire, so only the student can reliably complete this measure. And if we go through looking at these items, they're rated on a Likert scale from almost never to almost always. And if we look through, we can take some time to kind of read through some of these items, and I'll read it through it with you all. You can see that they're really, really relevant to the performance that students have at schools. I get excited about learning new things in class. I feel like I belong at my school. I feel like the things I do at school are important. I am a successful student. I'm really interested in the things I'm doing at school. I can really be myself at school. I think school matters and should be taken seriously. I do good work at school. I enjoy working on class projects and assignments. I feel like people at my school care about me. I feel it's important to do well in my classes. I do well in my class assignments. I feel happy when I'm working and learning at school. I'm treated with respect at my school. And I believe things I learn at my school will help me in my life. And last but not least, I get good grades in my classes. And so these 16 items are relatively easy to administer. The way that we use this tool, it's intended to be used as a screener, is that we measure students across these items at the beginning of each school year, at the middle of each school year, being right after the new year, and then towards the end in April. And what we really like to see is that the students who are completing this are having higher ratings across these areas. One of the big variables that's so important is connectedness. And school connectedness is going to be a protective factor that is going to help ameliorate so many of the risks related to eventual substance use. So I think it's really important that we have great subscales within this larger screener measure that we can use to start to figure out how students are doing. And for the students who score low on this measure, who don't have high scores on these screening items, this is how we're triaging immediately students to more group-based, more targeted intervention. So I just wanted to set that stage that this tool is provided school-wide, and that the students who indicate that they need more services at either the targeted or selective level, this is kind of our first gate. What's really important is that your screening process is likely going to be multi-gated. And what I mean by that is that you might be using this measure, but in our program and many others, you're also relying on things like referrals from school counselors, referral from teachers and administrators and parents. This is really, that collaborative team effort where everyone has an invested interest in all of the students, and knowing that to the extent possible, they're going to try to deal with issues and try to have prevention efforts at the school. But when those don't work, we have to be able to, as a team, provide substantive targeted interventions and individualized interventions. Okay, so that's kind of sets the stage about how our screening process, getting into that first gate, looks. The next thing that we would do when we start to jump into our targeted services, let me just go back here, is our targeted prevention. And these are kind of the 5 big areas that are most supported and most feasible to implement at that selected tier 2 level within schools for your prevention efforts. These things include a WellBeing Committee, brief check-ins with students, group therapies, electronic school home notes, and then last but not least, one of my favorite targeted interventions at the tier 2 level, check-in, check-out. And I'm going to go into each of these and describe a little bit more about what these look like. Okay, first is this idea of a well-being committee. Now, most schools have some school level building committee, and this committee's responsibility is largely to team and to build and support students around well-being and mental health, or positive behavior supports through academics. It could be a variety of different things. But really the focus at our secondary level is having a team that is dedicated and exclusively responsible for promoting well-being efforts within the school. And I think when you're looking at the secondary level, this is so critical, particularly thinking developmentally where these students are at, and they're really trying to figure out things. There's issues of identity, they're in a new location. There's so many interesting variables that come into play, and we really need to be thoughtful about this. And so a routing committee of teachers, if you can loop in students and other stakeholders, this is a really great committee to get started with. The idea is that this team would meet at least monthly. And in those monthly meetings, they would discuss things like school-wide well-being plans, students who are at risk or experiencing mental health concerns that they need to address through more selective and targeted prevention efforts. And they can also use this time to problem solve things around well-being at the school. And this would include mental health, as well as performance enhancement strategies, contingency management for teachers, really trying to take this kind of school-wide approach. It's not just the students who are worried about well-being, but we're also worried about teachers and staff, because it's an extremely taxing, it is probably one of the most difficult jobs, if not the most difficult jobs, to be an educator at any point within the continuum. And so we really have to make sure that they're feeling supported as well. And so these teams really help with those prevention efforts across the board. In these meetings, there should really be a problem-solving focus, and it should be providing access to solutions and discussion of practical issues that really face the school. I think it's really, really important that the problem-solving focus happens, because if not, these committees can tend to be just kind of discussion of the problems without any solution-driven approach to it, and that can be really problematic. Really, these committees lead the efforts to promote well-being throughout the school, and ideally, they would be using a team-initiated problem-solving approach. This kind of acronym is called TIPS, and the citation for that is listed at the bottom. This is a great program that really outlines effective steps for teaming around these issues and how to run a meeting in a really effective, organized, efficient way so that we're able to deliver on outcomes and we're not just kind of spinning our wheels in these meetings once a month. Now, to the extent that you can have more meetings, that will lead to more ability to have these conversations and be more responsive to the issues that your school might face. So bi-weekly would be ideal, and if you can meet even weekly, which I can understand being a tax to everyone's time, can be exponentially more helpful. The next targeted support for prevention is a brief check-in. The brief check-in initially occurs when we have students who we've screened and have kind of hit that threshold where we're saying, we think we need to follow up more with these students because based on their screener, they are not as connected in school. They have less efficacy about their own behavior. Subjectively, they don't feel as positive about what they're contributing or how they're perceived or their perception of school. So in this initial meeting, we meet for 20 minutes through a semi-structured conversation. And the main topics of our conversation focus on well-being overall, any issues of suicidal ideation, and any issues of trauma. And again, we're really kind of probing at the surface for these things, but we want to make sure that we can rule out, at least temporarily, that the student's not having any of these issues and that we can triage accordingly, because obviously if there's issues of suicidal ideation or there's acute trauma or even active trauma that the student's experiencing, you know, the approach to this is going to be fast-tracked to a more intensive prevention effort rather than some of the other efforts I'll mention in a little bit. So that's our initial meeting. lasts about 20 minutes long. And we do this so that we can be efficient, because as you can imagine, with 750 students, if we're looking at 15% of the population, it's gonna be a pretty large proportion that actually need these check-ins, which is a great thing. Ongoing, what we do is we continue with these 20-minute semi-structured conversations, but they occur bi-monthly. And so this is just a touch point so that students have a reliable, trusted adult in the school that they can talk to about any of the issues that they may have. And so this can be done by a variety of different providers that I'll mention later on. For the sake of our team, we have our graduate student therapists who provide these services, who are doing the ongoing check-in with some collaboration of school counselors. And again, we talk about well-being, suicidal ideation, and trauma, and we check in regarding any previous information. There's a lot that can be disclosed, and even though we may meet sporadically throughout the year, we always want to make sure that we're following up on these important things that the students experience. The other important piece for this brief check-in is that we provide training to school counselors, to social workers, to teachers, so that they feel more prepared to handle these issues. It can be extremely daunting if you aren't used to working with adolescents or individuals who report suicidal ideation or report trauma. And it's really important as a skilled therapist that you have the skill sets that you can effectively work with those students. And so a lot of what we're doing is also modeling and providing training to school staff that maybe lack some of those experiences based on their training or just, experience in that role. The next targeted intervention for prevention is the electronic school home note. And I'm a really big fan of this. I think that this is a really great strategy that integrates technology, but also improves the communication between the school and the home. And what we know is that parent involvement is such a large predictor of student success. And so to the extent that we can have a system in place, like an electronic school home note, we can really have a lot of students on it and have that communication going from home. So how it works is it's an effective intervention for improving student on-task behavior and parent connection. A really good resource that's available is the Tough Kid Electronic Home Notes. It goes up to 6th grade, and you can kind of extrapolate it for older adolescents that you're working with. But this is a nice tutorial about how to set it up using Google Sheets and having effective communication between those sheets and the ratings that people fill out each day so that parents can easily access it. It's allowing for that digital communication between the parent and the caregiver and school staff about targeted goals for the student. And so how these sheets typically work is there are items that parents, school staff may be concerned about, and those items are on a sheet, and students are either evaluated or rated throughout the day on their performance on those different items, or it could be a simple kind of check-in about those things throughout the day, which I think is really, really important because these are highly customizable. Although at the tier 2 level, there's some general sort of trends that you'll probably see. So, able to communicate their feelings effectively is going to be a big one for adolescents. Being able to communicate, any adversity that's going on, having forthcoming conversations, taking feedback, those kind of things tend to be some of the targeted goals that we're seeing with adolescents. The great part, like I said, about this is that it's automated. And so with that automated approach there's no graphing that's involved. The data is up there. So it's a great way to progress monitor information and have that connectiveness. And as you can imagine, if you're an outside agency, it's super easy with a record release to be able to have access to an electronic note like this. So if you have a client who maybe you're serving, the school can help with their prevention efforts and loop in really, really seamlessly with you all so that you have good continuity of care. Parents typically provide the contingencies at home for meeting these goals. If that becomes a prohibitive piece or that's not accessible due to circumstances at home, schools should really feel the ownership to be able to provide contingencies to make sure that students are trying to achieve those goals and engaging in those behaviors that should lead to the positive outcomes that we're seeking. The link here at the bottom is forward to this text if you're interested. And then there's also some great research that's come out in some peer-reviewed journals I cited down here. It's kind of the most recent about home notes, electronic home notes using a meta-analysis review. So if you kind of want to look at the data a little bit more and see some of the nuances, this is a great resource for everyone. Okay. The last targeted tier 2 intervention that I'm going to discuss is called Check-in, Check-out. This is seriously one of my favorite interventions. It has so much application. A recent meta-analysis showed that it was effective and that we should continue to work with this intervention on different applications with different populations to see the scope and breadth to which it works. And the really exciting thing about Check-in, Check-out, in my opinion, is it really gives a sustainable bang for your buck intervention at the tier 2 level. Let me talk a little bit about it. If you're interested in buying a really great text on this, I provided the link for it. And it also has some great videos and interactive content that help you set up this system. It's pretty well oiled as far as the training around implementation of this. And we're really lucky here at the University of Utah to have Leanne Hawken as a professor in the special ed program. And I've learned a lot about this, and I really tend to use it a lot in my practice. Some research on the bottom as well if you're interested. So this is a mentor-based intervention. And what that means is that students who maybe we see through our check-ins need some more support, we would put them on this check-in, check-out intervention, and they meet with a trusted adult mentor at the school each day when they arrive and when they leave. And this targeted intervention has, a standardized goals across all students who are on this program in the school. So for example, if we're working on appropriate communication and taking feedback, you might have those goals on your daily tracking sheet, and you check in with your mentor at the beginning of the day to just remind that those are the goals. It should be a quick few-minute interaction just to kind of get those students excited and prepared for what their expectations are. And then throughout the day, they have interactions with school staff across all their class periods, and they bring their sheet with them, or if it's an electronic format, the teachers can fill it out through that format, and they're rating the students on if they were engaging in that behavior, sometimes engaging in behavior, or not engaging in that behavior. And that really gives some perspective about what's happening across classes, and it also allows us to provide more prevention efforts if we need to support those students in different classes. Like maybe there's a teacher that they have a conflict with, and we can help to move in and kind of facilitate some of that problem solving and communication skills that are really, really important. Throughout the day, they get those ratings, those points get added up, they meet with their mentor at the end of the day. This mentor could be, a secretary, it could be a custodian, it could be someone who focuses on providing lunch services at school, it could be a teacher. It really is just someone who this individual trusts. If they earn a certain amount of points, typically they have access to some reward. For adolescents, this could be something that they're saving up for a larger reward that they want to exchange for. Things that are really popular right now with the students that I work with is virtual reality headsets, which are becoming more and more accessible. Video games are always exciting, especially if we can work on collaborative gaming. There's a lot of really cool problem solving gaming and collaborative gaming that are out for various consoles. And for our students who maybe need a little bit more support and prevention, this is a nice positive interaction that they could have. Again, this is just an example. You can individualize those contingencies, reinforcers for those contingencies, really to what works for the population individuals you serve. I have plenty of 6th grade students who just went hot Cheetos and Takis, and that is really, really, a lot easier to provide as well. So it really just depends on the population. Now, we use those goals and we track students and we give them performance feedback about how they're doing. And ideally, with these prevention efforts, we can have students perform so well, understand these pieces, and ideally fade them away from this intervention so that it's not needed in their day-to-day. The idea about this check and check out intervention, kind of in sum, is that it increases positive interactions between students, school staff, through multiple opportunities for feedback throughout the day. And that feedback piece is critical. These are students, they're at schools trying to learn. They're trying to figure out their emotions. They're trying to figure out how to cope with issues that come in their way. Many of them, who if they're at risk, may turn to maladaptive ways of coping, including substance use. And so what we're trying to do is increase connectedness to the school, positive interactions, so that these prevention efforts can deter and ideally make it so that these students don't feel like they need to find comfort from these other sources, and that there are really great sources of reinforcement available even at the target level throughout the school. What's really important is that not all students who are at that sort of tier 2 level will be able to be on check and check out. This requires infrastructure and systems and support and monitoring. And so that's why for me, I like to use a combination of check-in, check-out, those check-ins that we talked about earlier, school home notes, and then any individual therapeutic groups. And that's where we're gonna kind of head into next. Okay. So the next part of our webinar this morning, I'm going to talk about group therapies. So I talked about some of the sustainable tier 2 interventions that are kind of feasible within the school level without necessarily having mental health expertise coming in. I think these are things that you can receive training on. They're sustainable strategies. But when we move into group therapies, which is also a targeted prevention effort, there is a lot more training that's required. You're going to have to be a qualified mental health provider. You're going to have to receive training in these group therapies. But what's really important as we look at some of the programs that are here on the right, and I encourage you guys to check them out, is that really these are focusing a lot on similar content. And let me kind of describe some of that. First, in these group therapies, we're really focusing on problem solving and decision making. Adolescents have a really, really hard time with problem solving and decision making. Their brains aren't fully developed for the part of the frontal lobe that's really required in all of those executive functionings until into their 20s. And so what we know is that we have to teach those skills. And some students are more adept to have these things because their parents teach them those things, because they maybe have more supports, maybe they receive previous prevention efforts through therapy, but many students don't. And many students are having poor problem solving, poor decision making modeled for them frequently. And so a lot of that is, how are we teaching those skills? Also things like emotional understanding and expression. It's very, very challenging for adolescents to express themselves in a pro-social, effective way. That's a skill that needs to be learned. It's much more, it's much easier to get angry and mad and to behave that way, particularly if a lot of that is modeled. But what I think is really important is that we are teaching these skills, and that sometimes kids need to be in groups to receive those skills in a more explicit way, practicing it with peers and learning and talking and making themselves vulnerable in a safe space. We also focus on things like social skills and support, because as you can imagine, adolescents don't always have the best social skills. When you figure out what you're supposed to do in elementary school, that's a different set of social skills than how you're supposed to behave as an adolescent. And particularly as you get older, the social nuance becomes much more refined, and it can be really challenging to keep up, especially in some of these interpersonal aspects that are so prevalent in adolescence. And with things like access to social media, social skills become even more important, and it kind of ties in really well. Another piece is interpersonal and communication skills. This is always an issue that I think I experience with adolescents, especially those who are more at risk. They have less effective ways of communicating. They have less nuance in their interpersonal interactions, either because this isn't modeled as well or because they were never taught. And last but not least is this conflict resolution skills. This is something that everyone can benefit from. We are trying to teach students how to be poised and constructive in their approach, because I know for myself personally and many of the individuals I work with, it never feels good when you have something that comes across as abrasive or something that comes across as argumentative. And I think adolescents need to have more of that support so that they know how to navigate well under those circumstances. Some of these programs are the ones that we tend to use as targeted prevention efforts in schools. First is ADAPT, which is the advanced decision-making and problem solving for teens. This is from my colleague, Jason Burrows-Sanchez, who is the director of our Mountain Plains PTTC. This is a fantastic program for teens, particularly Latinx students who you might be working at. This kind of had that intention as it was developed. It's a really just phenomenal program to use because it not only helps with substance use prevention at the tier 2 level, but it really hones in on these bulleted items on the left that are so critical. Other programs we use are Coping Power. This is around anger management and being able to navigate some of these more challenging interactions that you may have interpersonally. And this is typically done in a group format, and it's really nice because you can bring everyone together. It's very manualized, especially if you're newer or learning how to implement some of these tier 2 interventions in schools. Next is Merrill Strong Teens. This is a curriculum you can use at the universal tier 1 level. It goes all the way from preschool all the way through 12th. It's a fantastic manual to use. It's very approachable, and I think allows for the flexibility at the group level, the tier 2 level, so that we can kind of target on some of these skills as well. So I'd really encourage you guys to consider this one. It's very approachable, very affordable. And last but not least, focusing on some mindfulness strategies, mindfulness-based groups, because this will be a really nice addition around some of these supports. Still Quiet Place is a great one for adolescents that I would highly encourage. Okay. So with these group therapies, like I mentioned before, it's really important that you receive some training. This is typically done by qualified mental health providers. If you are a school counselor who maybe is learning how to do more of these therapeutic services, because in sort of the traditional model of school counselors, they're focusing more on college career readiness rather than service provision. I think here in Utah, we have some movement in a different direction. I'm not sure what that is looking like nationally, but here we're really trying to focus on more service provision as a state with a really high youth suicide rate. We really need to be able to provide some really strong prevention groups at the school level where we have access to these students. All right, moving on to our individualized prevention efforts, and really how this looks is through individualized psychotherapy and community collaboration. So this is kind of that top of the triangle again, and really it's for the students who need more. Maybe they're in group and also need some individual therapy. Maybe these individuals are not in a group format, but they need to have more intensive services. And so we can triage it out depending on the need and how students are performing in their different therapies. With individual psychotherapy, again, this has to be provided by a qualified mental health provider. We're really diving in now, and we're going to be engaging in services that are inherently making students vulnerable because they're disclosing information that could be sensitive, traumatic, could trigger different experiences for them. So I think it's really important to know that this really does require a certain level of training and supervision. And so like we'll talk about a little bit later, I think there's some really great opportunities to collaborate with community agencies around some of these services, because unfortunately in schools, we just have such a huge shortage of mental health providers, despite fabulous efforts like here in Utah, where this year they released about $19 million in funds for student mental health supports, which is just a real good showing, in my opinion, of the commitment to improve these things at the school level. Okay, so what are some of the characteristics or symptoms that we're treating through individual psychotherapy? These are things like anxiety, depression, trauma, and interpersonal problems. This is pretty much the gamut of what we're seeing. What we do is, if we are unable to provide services based on the referral problem, so for example, if we had more acute mental illness, then we would make sure that we're connecting with community providers, or even referring out to a community so they have a more sustainable long-term effort, and one that maybe gives access to medication management or some of these other really critical services that are going to enhance services for students who maybe are the most at risk, maybe currently using substance use, and we're trying to really reduce that from that prevention effort is to try to just, harm reduction, make sure that they come in contact with more access to social supports and other therapeutic supports. With community collaboration, we're connecting explicitly, purposefully with mental health providers and medical providers who are in the community. And that's everyone, or probably a majority of folks who are on the webinar this morning. It's how can the schools do a better job of looping in with you? And what can you all do to loop in with the schools? And we'll talk a little bit more about that. But at this, individual prevention efforts, we are really trying to help reduce any of the symptoms that individuals have, harm reduction processes, and kind of just really trying to make sure that it doesn't get worse than it's at right now. And that's a really important prevention effort, because as you can know, there's a slippery slope that we can go on, and when students are starting to use substances, the longer that they're doing it, the earlier on that they start to engage those things, those outcomes are not as positive. Okay. I'm going to spend some time now for about the next 10 minutes or so talking about progress monitoring, and then what you all can do as community providers to help engage in this process. So up to this point, we've talked a lot about the supports at the different tiers and what those prevention efforts can look like. One of the pieces that I think super important as we are in this age of database decision-making, which is so critical, is using good measurement to figure out how students are doing. We use two measures right now for most of our students who are at the tier 2 and tier 3 level. We use the same measure. If we need to use measures other than this, we do, but we really individualize it based on the presenting problem. The reason why I like these two measures I'm going to show you is because they were designed as screeners, but they're also great to use as progress monitoring, and we can see some change over time. This first measure is called the Youth Internalizing Problem Screener. This was developed by Tyler Renshaw from Utah State in 2019. Again, it's freely available on the Open Science Forum. And I'd encourage you guys to look through this. This is in a formative process. And so this is still developing some more of the psychometrics around it. It does have some strong initial psychometrics, which is great. This measure is only 10 items, so it's brief, and there's a cutoff score of 21. So if individuals have a score higher than 21, then we'd say that they're at risk. And so it's a nice way for us to monitor over time if we start to see the risk level go down. And so we can kind of see some practical significance to some of these things. These items include things that are related to internalizing problem behavior. So these are not the, acting out, the more explicit observable things. These are the stuff that we're seeing that are more covert. So things like I feel anxious, or I feel nervous or afraid. I feel very tired or drained of energy. I find it hard to relax and settle down. I get bothered by things and didn't bother me before. I have uncomfortable, intense feelings in my body. I feel moody or grumpy. I feel like I'm gonna panic or think I might lose control. I not really enjoy doing anything anymore. I feel worthless or lonely when I'm around other people. I have headaches, stomach aches, or other pains. And so they go through this and they can fill this out. And we like to use this as a progress monitoring tool, similar to like if you were in a clinical practice or an agency, you might have your client fill out a brief measure every time they come in. And so we do this at our weekly sessions when we're working with individuals. And then if we're doing with groups, we don't tend to do it as often just because there's so many more students who need to do it. We may do it in a more probed fashion where we're doing it maybe every other week or so, which is just a nice way to progress monitor. And I think from a practical standpoint, this is applied work that we're doing in the schools. So we're not necessarily always using all elements for research. And so when we're trying to conceptualize this applied work, we're thinking what's going to actually stick? What is going to be feasible for schools to use and monitor over time? And using this database decision-making, we can look at students who are responding well and say, hey, guess what? You may not need to be a part of this group after we complete this one because you've learned some of these great skills. And look, on these screeners, your symptomology that you're reporting is not as elevated. And so I think these are really important tools that we can use that are highly accessible. Okay, the next one looks very similar. It's the Youth Externalizing Problem Screener. This one focuses more on problems that you might see students engage in. They are more overt. I lose my temper and get angry with other people. I have a hard time sitting still when other people want me to. I fight and argue with other people. I break rules whenever I feel like it, talk a lot and interrupt others when they are talking. I say or do mean things to hurt other people. I have a hard time focusing on things that are important. I like to annoy people or make them upset. I get distracted by the little things happening around me and I choose not to follow directions and don't listen to adults. This one, obviously, we can look at as well and monitor over time. And we can start to say that, their perception of rating this has gone down. With some of these, of course, externalizing problem behaviors, we can also measure them more objectively. So when we talked about check in, check out before, that could be something that's targeted on a goal. So saying, I keep my cool when people make me mad. Like that might be the target behavior we're trying to reinforce for those students. Or it could be, I ask for help when I'm feeling afraid or nervous, if we're thinking of more internalized. So we're trying to always frame these things in an adaptive skill that kids can do, because if they can do those things, hopefully they won't be allocating their behavior to the things that have gotten kind of to the place where they're at, because we're starting to provide reinforcement and the recognition for them engaging in these pro-social behaviors that are in many ways hard to do, unpleasant, they feel uncomfortable. For many of these students, it's gonna be their first time learning it. So I really love these measures. I think it's a fabulous way that we can monitor progress and look at students in a more nuanced way to kind of respond to those things that come up. Okay, with the next 5 minutes that I have, I'm gonna go through this kind of process again and talk about what you can do as community providers and agencies working around prevention efforts with schools. So as a quick review, Tier 1, 80% of students, this is where we're having school-wide efforts of social emotional learning, school culture, teacher well-being, family involvement. These are the critical foundation that all this is built on. Then at the Tier 2 level, we have things like groups and check-ins and other interventions that could help support students at a targeted way if needed. It's really, really important to have these supports. I think we're really lucky because of the support from the Cambia Health Foundation to bring graduate students into the schools to provide those services. But this could easily be folks in the community with agencies coming in doing similar work. And then at the Tier 3 level, these are these individual psychotherapies for various different issues. And then if we have more acute needs that we aren't able to handle, then we will refer to those out through community providers and have continuity so we can have this collaborative wraparound services that really focus on treating the whole child and preventing them from developing other symptoms, developing issues of substance use, health problems later down the road. And so what's really important, if you look at the arrows, is that there's a lot of communication between the tiers. We can bump people up as needed. We can provide targeted supports, individualized supports. Students could be directly referred to tier 3 if, when we go through the process, we realize they need those things. And then we're encouraging teachers, parents, school counselors, students themselves to make referrals, because we want to destigmatize mental health and well-being supports. And I think a great place to do that is in our public schools, because it's an area of learning and growth. And in my opinion, those skills, social emotional learning, well-being, mental health, those are all skills that need to be developed. And so why would we not integrate it there from a prevention standpoint? Okay, let's move on to what you all can do. Okay, so who facilitates targeted and individualized prevention efforts with students? Well, there's a variety of mental health providers. These could be school social workers, school counselors, school psychologists, school administrators and teachers, parents and caregivers, and community agencies in collaboration with those public schools. For many of you, I hope that these are nuanced, different mental health providers. If not, let me just do a quick review about some of the subtle nuances about them. So social workers tend to work in schools and provide efforts around mental health supports. They can provide therapeutic supports, link in with families. They could have efforts to connect communities to make sure that students are being supported in the best way possible. School counselors traditionally are really focused on college career readiness, and many times their training can be variable about how much they're receiving work on therapeutic skills. Depending on how states outline what they do, that could also change their practice. But ideally, school counselors are qualified people in all schools. These are like first-line people who, if we can give some more training and support to around social emotional learning, doing some of these group interventions, I think we can make a huge impact with some of the resources we already have. School psychologists traditionally are people who test individuals for qualification into special education. In a more contemporary model, school psychologists also provide a ton of pre-referral interventions. So these are prevention type services to keep students out of special education, where we know outcomes tend to be less positive than students who get to stay in a less restrictive general education environment. School administrators and teachers, these are such critical people. They are there every day providing these services in these micro interactions, passing students in the hallway, telling them how they think their shirt's cool, helping them open their locker when they get locked out. All of these little small things, these build the culture, these build relationships, and kids pay attention to these things, and they want to feel safe and trusted in these environments. Parents and caregivers can be involved. This is so critical. To the extent they're involved, we're really going to see some of these outcomes driven in positive ways. And there actually needs to be explicit efforts at the school-wide level to include parents. And of course, there's community agencies. This is, what supports can we collaborate in as the community, and what would that look like? Let me show you a little bit more on our next slide. So how do we partner with these schools? What can you all do? First, you can initiate relationships with local schools and districts. All it takes is you picking up a phone, talking to the principal, shooting them an email, or even better yet, just drop by the school. Hey, we're a community mental health agency. I wanted to see if we could set up a time to meet and chat a little bit more about how our community mental health agency can partner with your school to help improve outcomes for students. And there's some really great resources online about how you can go through some of that process to set some of that up. We all are also looking at supporting school mental health, positive behavior interventions and supports, and social emotional learning efforts. And all these things are kind of talking about similar things. There is a lot of overlap. And what's really important is that you, as the agency, the community provider, you could sponsor related events at the school. You could say, hey, I want to sponsor like a well-being week at the school. What could we do? Is there stuff that we could donate? Is there anything that we can do to come and do a presentation to start to get people to understand these things? This is, a grassroots effort of community support to get people to understand that people experience mental health concerns, people experience behavior, social, emotional concerns that will lead to negative outcomes like substance use if not handled in a prevention way. We're also looking at providing training to school staff and families. This is something that you all could do. You could talk about, hey, can we come in and provide a PD, a professional development for your staff around working with students who experience trauma? Or what about working with students who maybe have issues of anxiety or depression? I think these are really great ways that staff and families, students would really appreciate, because it normalizes that people are experiencing these things, and that's okay to ask for help, and it's okay that these problems exist. Contracting with schools to provide services. Kind of taking a step further, a lot of what you can do, what I've seen agencies here do in Utah, is they collaborate explicitly and sign contracts to have their providers coming in to provide some of these school mental health services. It's a great way to link those things up. And it also is a nice way for you to triage out students who maybe need some more intensive services. There's kind of like that natural connection with the agency that's provided. And what's really nice about this, it doesn't rely on any of their health insurance or access to health insurance. It's kind of like a commitment that the school or district makes to get mental health services in the school. You can also collaborate with schools to write grants and proposals. The grant that I submitted with the Cambia Health Foundation was a collaborative effort with the schools that we work in. They actually brought it up to me and said, hey, let's submit for this grant. We want to try to sustain this project for 2 years. I love that investment. And we couldn't have done it if it wasn't for the school's efforts and the Cambia Health Foundation. Create referral networks with related service providers, talking to people at the schools, the school psychologists, the social workers, all those people I mentioned before, get them familiar with what you do as agencies so that they can say, hey, you know what, this sounds like something that we could probably loop in this community agency with. Or maybe you're in the school and say, hey, we have this support. Let's get these people in to help with our prevention efforts. Okay, so that brings me to the end of the content that I wanted to go over today, talking about these tier 2, tier 3 services for prevention efforts in schools. I want to open it up now for some questions before we wrap up. And as a friendly reminder, we're going to save some time at the end so you have a chance to complete the GIPRA survey for this webinar.
Okay, Erin, we've got some great questions. The first one is from Abby. She is asking for students to complete this screening, and this was the screening at the very beginning that you went over, well, and probably any screening for that matter. Do you secure parent consent?
That's a great question. You're going to have to look at your local school district, state board of education guidelines, state guidelines. The way it works in Utah is that you can do screening for these services. We tend to give these students school-wide. And so what that means is if any service is privy to all students school-wide, then there's not a necessity for parental consent because it's available as a school-wide practice. So what you really want to do is get your school to commit to this is a school-wide endeavor that we do, just in the same way that students receive a breakfast prepared for them here in Utah. There's no consent process for that. Every student has a breakfast available for them if they need it. And so we want to kind of approach it from that way. Now that creates some potential ethical issues because as you can imagine, when you do screening, you have to help everyone you screen. So before you jump into screening efforts at this level, make sure that you have sustainability for services in place, because then at the next level, when you've screened those students, then you need to send consent forms home to parents and say, hey, your student was at risk for some of these things. Do you want to opt in for services or not? And I think that that tends to be a really effective way. Here in Utah, they're kind of like the tier 2 consent form, a pre-referral intervention. So that's at least how we function with some of the work we do. I would really encourage you all to ask your schools, local education authorities about any guidelines so that you're in compliance with their guidelines and procedures.
Great, thank you. The next question is from Elise. Does the WellBeing Committee that you discussed have students on the committee?
Yes, we do have students on the committee. That's an important member of the committee is students at the school. What we tend to do is try to identify kind of the students, and they have their own committee, like a kind of a student well-being team that they have for themselves. And then we like to incorporate them into the decision-making and problem-solving with the larger entity, because all stakeholders, including the students, need to have a voice. It's really, really important, and I think it really helps validate. And I appreciate your question on that.
The next question, Erin, and this has to do with when you were talking about the tools, the mental health tools, like such as ADAPT and the others where you had 4 on the page. Are any of these evidence-based, and if so, which ones?
Yeah, I love that question. That's great. So the ADAPT program, the Coping Power program, those are very, very clearly evidence-based practices in the literature. Looking at the Strong Kids curriculum, it's super comprehensive. There's some great research on it. I'm not sure if it actually meets the criteria of an evidence-based practice or if it's an emerging practice. It definitely has some research to support it, but I don't know if it meets that sort of that rigorous criteria that we're looking for as that evidence-based practice. as far as the other one, the mindfulness-based programs, there's a ton of great literature showing that mindfulness-based interventions is an evidence-based practice for adolescents. These programs tap into those kind of evidence-based strategies. And so where many of them maybe aren't evidence-based programs themselves because they haven't gone through the rigorous testing of research and things like that, many of them are built on the foundation of evidence-based practices kind of looped in together. And so what I would encourage more folks to do is continue doing research on these programs so we can, get them in those categories because they have great impact for the students that we work with.
Yeah, so we have 5 more minutes for questions. If you have a question, feel free to add it to the chat feature. Okay. Elise has a comment. I love the idea that students are on the committee because I think they can add value and current experience. But how do you deal with the privacy of the kids who need mental health help?
Yeah, thanks for having that question. That's great insight. So what we do is when we have the students join those committee meetings, there's kind of like time that we talk about things that are more confidential, that are only privy to school staff and faculty. And then when it's appropriate, we can have other stakeholders, students join, and that's a kind of a more separate agenda because, of course, we don't want the one student on the committee to have all the dirt about, the students who are most at risk at the school. That could be incredibly problematic. So we're really thoughtful about those pieces because we don't want anyone to feel unsafe or vulnerable for being open about how they feel or some of the risks that they experience.
Okay, well, if anyone has any additional questions, feel free to still send it through the chat feature. As you'll see on your screen right now, our next webinar will be on preventing relapse by providing comprehensive oral health care with substance use disorders. It should be a great with substance use disorder treatment. It'll be a great webinar by Dr. Glenn Hansen, and that will be on Wednesday, August 28th at 1:00 p.m. Make note of the new time. Most of our webinars have been at 11 o'clock. Additionally, for those of you who would like to view our past webinars, you can click on our website to be able to access those. We record them all and post them. And please remember to complete the GIPRA survey. You can either use your phone and click on the QR code you see on your screen, and I'm also going to include the link to the survey again in the chat feature. And again, I want to thank everyone for joining us today. Like I said, a recording will be posted. It usually takes us about a week. Additionally, all of the slides in a PDF format will be posted. So if you would like to download those to refer back. And again, Erin, thank you so much. What a great webinar. And we hope to see you all at our next webinar.